to you from beautiful Vancouver, Canada. This is Scuderia F1, the podcast that is always up to speed with the latest Formula One news. Follow us on Twitter at Scuderia F1 Pod and subscribe to the podcast on iTunes and Stitcher. Now, here's your host, Mark Daly.
Hello and welcome to Scuderia F1, the podcast that is always up to speed with Formula One racing. My name is Mark Daly. This is episode number 4, and for the first time, I'm not flying solo. I'd like to welcome my good friend, Mr. Kevin Laramée, to the show. Kevin, how are you doing today?
I am great, Mark. It's a pleasure to be talking about Formula One, one of the sports that caught my attention when I was a kid. Yes, Jacques Villeneuve has a lot of things to do with it, but that sport, the speed, the sound, it always caught my attention.
Definitely. And this is a first for, well, definitely for me. We've collaborated on many things over the last couple of years, but this is a first because this is the first time that I'm doing a non-soccer related podcast with you. This isn't Off the Woodworks or From the Backline or Two Solitude. So this is cool and this is exciting. So welcome to the show. But you are from Montreal, the home of the Canadian Grand Prix, and there's always talk each and every year why Montreal is a place that Formula One, the teams, the drivers, and the fans want to go. In one sentence, can you just tell everybody, why does F1 love Montreal?
One thing that has been overlooked for years, the track. The track itself, it's different than the rest of the world. The straight lines, that hairpin, that different feel of a race that, feels open. Even if the championship has been won almost, we've seen it for years with Mercedes. When you get to Gilles Villeneuve circuit, it's always open. It's always up for grabs. Will the weather continue to be there? Who knows? And the timing of the race as well. In Europe, it comes in prime time. So it's the one time instead of watching it in the afternoon, they can sit down, have their bottle of wine and their dinner, and watch Formula One. So for a lot of the reason and the aesthetic on the island, all those reasons, and Montreal is a great tourism city. So those reasons makes it a can't miss race in the season.
Definitely. Very cool. Well, Montreal is coming up in about 2 months, but before we get to that, there's a couple of more races. We've got China coming up next week and Monaco in a couple of weeks' time, and Russia, of course. But this past weekend, we had Grand Prix number 2, and that was in Bahrain. Win number 2 on the season for Nico Rosberg, a P3 for Lewis Hamilton. An exploded Ferrari, Sebastian Vettel didn't even make the starting grid. We saw a little bit of it, almost everything again this past weekend. What did you think of the race?
Well, it was quite difficult for Lewis Hamilton in the opening lap, and that was quite interesting, getting banged up and finally finishing in the third spot of the podium. So it's an interesting race for Lewis Hamilton, which is twice in a row now. But Rosberg domination, again, it's looking like the gap is maybe closing a little, but you mentioned the explosion of Vettel's car, and that with the lack of maybe that final stability with the car to make sure it doesn't break all the time. The speed is up there, but it seems like they have to push the car really hard to get it to where Mercedes is. But once they've closed that gap, we'll see exciting race. But if you take out the dominance of Nico Rosberg, the race was exciting in itself. We're seeing Haas Racing coming into the fold. We're seeing great overtake, and we're seeing a great race and different pit strategies. And one thing that really caught my attention is, well, pit strategies are not to say important, they are. But what I mean is the timing and the strategy of it is a little different because they rely on the opposition and they're ready to change their strategy in 1 second. Okay, let's change this and we're going to do 3 stop instead of 2 and roll with it of the situation of the race. And that was really intriguing to me and makes for actually quite an interesting season so far, even though Rosberg won both races.
Yeah, and the new tire strategy is actually quite it's quite fascinating because the whole idea behind it was to give the team more options, and we've seen how different teams have had different strategies, how it worked well for Mercedes in Australia and didn't work so well for Ferrari. And again, this past weekend, we saw how that Haas and Romain Grosjean took quite an aggressive tire strategy, and it really paid off for them compared to Williams, who went for more conservative two-stop strategy on the medium tires, and we're seeing that if you risk a little bit more, the payoffs are there. But if you go too conservative, it has almost the flip side. But interesting, you should mention right off the start that Lewis Hamilton had a bit of troubles again. That's 2 races in the row where he's had a good start on the grid, or a good starting position, I should say. And when he actually pulling off from the line was not so good. In Australia, obviously, he had a bit of a bang with Nico Rosberg in the first corner after Sebastian Vettel beat them both and disappeared down the track. But this weekend, again, he didn't get off the line cleanly. Nico Rosberg got away. And then it was interesting, too, when Valtteri Bottas actually rammed Lewis Hamilton in turn 1. You could see, looking at the replay, well, what is Bottas doing? But when you watch and see what Hamilton is doing, he actually leaves the door open a little bit. He takes a very wide line into the turn. Bottas is obviously a little bit further back, and you could see why maybe he didn't have enough room to make the pass, why he actually tried to do it. He got punished. He had a drive-through penalty, but it did, I think, affects Hamilton's car. He had a bit of damage on the bodywork, but it was interesting. I was watching as the race unfolded that Lewis was setting similar lap times to his teammate Nico Rosberg. Of course, you could make the argument that, well, maybe Nico was only driving as hard as he needed to be because he was quite far down the road at most of the time. Raikkonen was fairly close after one pit stop. I think it was Nico's second stop. He had a bit of trouble with one tire, and that the gap closed up, but he was never really under any threat. And I think that Hamilton, after 2 races and having a second and a third and being 17 points behind his teammate, who has 50 points compared to Hamilton's 33, is probably, I would think for him, considering the troubles he's had, is probably a pretty good result for him.
No, yeah, I just want to go back to Hamilton for a second. You mentioned how he came basically in both opening turns of both races so far. He was a little too wide in the turns, and he created a lot of opening for his opposition. And I think it maybe when you talk about being too conservative, if you go a little too wide into a corner because you want to make sure you don't miss the apex, you go a little wider to cut back in a little closer to get that speed coming off the turn. If you're a little wary of what's going on after the first turn, example, if you think your teammate is going to overtake you, you might go a little wider just to trying to get that little edge, that little faster speed coming out of that turn than if you get the pure apex coming in the right way into the turn. So that's really interesting to me because twice in 2 races, it's not a coincidence. Is it going to happen in China? Is it going to be still the same position in qualifying to make sure that we see this or not in the race? It's kind of interesting because if I was Hamilton, maybe you're better off starting second or third because you don't have those questions. You just go for it. When you're first, you're asking too many questions. And it might be the reason why in those 2 first turns in 2 weeks, he was a little too wide.
Yeah, and it's funny too. It took him a long time to get that 50th pole position, and he got that in Australia. Then again this past weekend in Bahrain, and of course, what I found really interesting too was another tidbit that we were just sort of builds on what we were talking about the tires just now. But with the new tire regulations, he was actually a 1/10 of a second faster than Mark Webber's fastest lap ever at Bahrain, which he set back in 2005. So there's a lot of unintended consequences, or maybe they were intended. I'm not really all that sure, but faster lap times, more competitive racing, and it's really turning out to be quite something. But also at the start, another person that surprised me a little bit was Kimi Räikkönen, who started in P4. He had a very bad start, but once the race actually started going, his Ferrari had quite a lot of pace. Obviously, he had some troubles in Australia and had an engine let go on him after the restart after Alonso's big crash there, but he actually looked quite good. So I was wondering to myself, how would Ferrari have done if Sebastian Vettel was actually able to start that race and complete the full race distance? Again, we'll see maybe in a week in China, but that Ferrari definitely has some pace, so it'll be interesting to see if they can keep going. And then behind them, it seems after the Ferraris and the Mercedes, that the rest of the order, there's some very good racing there. We've seen that last or in the first race between the Toro Rossos. Yes, the very open. And Haas has been a very, very big surprise, I think, for most people. I think a lot of people were thinking after the Australia that it was a bit of a fluke that Romain Grosjean ended up in P6, that maybe he benefited a little bit from the red flag situation. Possibly he did, but he proved again this weekend, right tire strategy, and it's a good car, and they believe that they can still get another half a second per lap. But what do you think? Do you think, as race fans here in North America, do you think it's important to have a competitive American or a North American team in Formula One?
Well, we'll see. It really never happened before, doesn't it? If we go back to the early 90s with the Michael Mansell's team and all that, it was different. It wasn't like the way it is today with social media and everything. But Haas has impressed me so much, and I have to fight my mouth to not say Newman Haas at every time, because for me, Newman Haas is IRL back then and Champ Car. It's the spiritual beginnings of the team we're seeing in F1 now with us in the United States, and Newman Haas, Paul Newman, the spiritual leader of this team. I have to imagine he's looking down from heaven at this team with a couple of points and smiling for sure. But the way they got them points with strategy, with a little bit of luck, but they adjusted to the race situation. And I think that's the biggest difference this year than the other year because of the different gum on the tires. You talk about the super soft and the medium and the soft, that they throw the monkey wrench in it. You have to use the worst ones at least once in the race for that amount of laps or whatever, and it gives a monkey wrench in the race that you have to adjust accordingly. All those pieces together makes that every team has to adjust to the team that's close to them in the race. And you talked about how Williams was conservative, they didn't do this, and you don't gain position, you just slide and finish out of the points. Newman Haas, if there's one thing they're used to, is adjusting to race situation because of the experience of the crew and the team in all the different North American race circuit they've been part of. How many do you think in NASCAR, they're not used to stopping in races and restarting them all the time? Yeah, that's what it is. In the car, the same amount of, everybody's got the same chassis. So you have to differentiate yourself in different ways. So all those gimmick and trying to put duct tape here and there, the different North American way of racing brought to F1 with money and a decent motor and the Ferrari partnership makes for at least a good try, and they at the same level. And they were able to use the experience they had in the late 90s and 2000 up to this point in North America to adjust the race situation. And I think that's the reason why Haas has been in the points for the 2 races in the season, is because of their experience to manage an actual race.
Yeah, definitely. And it was interesting. Gene Haas said earlier this week that one thing that NASCAR taught him was it was very important who you make friends with. Just basically to sum it up, and having that.
It's like 5 families NASCAR, so you have to be friends with everyone.
Yeah, pretty much. But having that technical relationship with Ferrari, having the access to their wind tunnel, the Ferrari parts, the latest spec of the Ferrari engine is huge. And Grosjean said it's one of the best cars that he's ever driven. And it's amazing to think that this is a team that's literally just rolled up. It's a brand new team, and you can just tell that things are going along well there. But also what's interesting too is that Sauber has been having financial problems, and apparently they just got some advance from one of their sponsors to pay their to pay for their employees' salaries for the past month. And there's been some talk that perhaps they might be like a Ferrari C team, if you want to call the Haas team a Ferrari B team with all the Ferrari parts and things in there, and maybe it might become branded as Alfa Romeo. So it's quite interesting. And then also the Ferrari also supplies the 2015 engines to Toro Rosso, and we saw Max Verstappen in P6. But also, I think another car that maybe is not getting the recognition it deserves so far is the Red Bull. Daniel Ricciardo was P4 in Australia and in Bahrain. And Danny Kvyat was, he didn't make it to the start, very much like Seb did in Bahrain. He didn't make it to the start in Australia, but he managed a P7. And then Massa and Bottas, they just didn't really do all that well for Williams. They managed to get a P8 and P9, but they didn't really set any world on fire, except for maybe Bottas in turn 1. But a very enjoyable race, I thought, this past weekend.
You know what? This is basically a subjective observation, and I'm going to say it outright, but the race seems to go faster. The race seems to be more like, oh, it's already over? Wow, it's so eventful, and so you're not just waiting for the pit stop. It's not just a procession and then a couple of intrigue. Oh, they're gonna pass him in the pit. Oh, it's not like that anymore. And this race really, those 2 races actually really felt that way. That, you know what, it's still a race. Yeah, there's a couple cars who are better than the other cars, but because of the difference of tires and because of the brand new parts and some of the rules change and the qualification process now back to what it was last year, all those things combined makes for a very eventful actual race, and not just the hype to it and the post race. What's actually really interesting this year is the race, the new stars, the name coming, the Romain Grosjean performance. All those little things combined makes for the race to seem to go faster when you're watching it.
Well, definitely, and I think that we'll talk about the qualifying here in a moment, but definitely it's good to see like the action on the track. Of course, in the first couple of places on the track hasn't been too exciting. We saw in Australia how Vettel got very close to Hamilton as their tires. I think Hamilton's tires started to go a little bit at the end of the Australian Grand Prix, and then Vettel caught up, and then had a bit of an uncharacteristic mistake at one of the very last turns before the pit straight there, and then he just ran out of laps to close the gap. But beyond that, down the order, we see quite a lot of racing, and I thought it was really quite something to watch Romain Grosjean this past weekend just really cut his way through the order. Just it was really really enjoyable to watch, and I was kind of wondering that once he got into that P5, would he be able to catch Ricciardo, who was in P4? It looked for maybe a lap or two that the gap was maybe coming down, and then I noticed that perhaps maybe his tires were starting to go a little bit at that point, and the gap sort of stabilized, and then slowly Ricciardo pulled out a little bit. But Grosjean was voted to have as the driver of the week after both of those two races, and he's been, I think, the highlights through the first two races. We didn't see a rematch of Sainz and Verstappen this past weekend because that was quite enjoyable in Australia as well.
Verstappen is making a name for himself this year. And the first name we're saying, because yes, his father, who we all remember his Jordan career back in the mid-90s to late 90s for the wrong reasons, probably, as being usually the back of the pack and sometimes in the gravel pit. But Max is really making a name for himself this year with doing the best what he can with the actual car and getting performances, but especially lap times and overtaking, and just seems to have a certain good style to watch, and that attracts the attention. And he's a name that's been talked about really, really a lot this year, that look, he should get called up to the main squad right now. He's probably better than the two guys he got in Red Bull right now. What is he doing with Silvio Toro Rosso? So those comparison with his Sainz, is a colleague as well, has been really made this year quite interesting with those two teams compared.
Definitely, and I think that it will be most likely Verstappen going to the big Red Bull team, perhaps then to Mercedes, because I believe he was offered a reserve driver role before 2015, and I think he was quite brave to choose to maybe go to the less sexy option and go to Toro Rosso. It was a bit of a gamble, but he definitely made a name for himself for all the right reasons on the track in 2015, and who knows, they have thrown his name out there for Ferrari, but Ferrari's like one of those teams that prefers to go for like the big established, the well-known driver, like the rock star kind of driver, as it were. You know,
the Romain Grosjean, you mean?
Well, he's definitely
he's quite established now.
He
has been 2 years away, but how he came back with the attitude, the energy, the happy-go-lucky type of attitude he's having now, what he learned in his years away by technically helping build this car, and his experience in F1 in the years prior really shows when you're trying to build a new car. But that's what it's been talking about. It's going to be hard for Haas to keep Grosjean for next year because, well, there are probably going to be some people knocking on his door.
Well, definitely. I mean, the last couple of years with Lotus, as that team kind of floundered and then was taken over by Renault again, and then Grosjean taking a risk and going to a brand new team like Haas was a gamble from his point of view, but he didn't have anything to lose. It was either stay at Lotus, like you say, and basically kind of be out of the sport, or go to a team that has the funding, has the resources, has a really good chassis, has a really good engine. And he's really proved it for through the first couple of races, and they believe that they can get points every race. We'll see again next week whether or not they can do it in China. But the other thing that's going to be interesting in China is that this week they did finally manage to vote out the controversial new elimination type qualifying, and they've gone back to last year's qualifying where you have the Q1, Q2, Q3, and after Q1, X number of cars are eliminated, obviously because it depends like from year to year depending on the size of the field. And the same thing, Q2, X number of cars are eliminated. Then you get into Q3 and you get basically a shootout between the last 10 cars. But we were talking a little bit before we started this one. You actually prefer the older type qualifying that we saw like in the late 90s, early 2000s, where you basically had 60 minutes for a qualifying session and it was just the best time in the entire 1 hour session or whatever it was would be the guy that would get onto the pole position. And it kind of was interesting to see as how times would change throughout the entire session and how that you found that quite exciting.
Yes, for many different reasons. Not just because you get maybe 3-4 cars that are actually finishing their lap after the last minute as well pass by, and he beats the time. Oh, will he do it? Oh, he just got the ball. That excitement was fun. But for me, the more purest aspect of that qualification, where you have 60 minutes. The track is not going to be the same for 60 minutes. There's some point in that 60 minutes that the track is going to be perfect temperature, perfect wind condition, perfect amount of traffic on that track to get that time. So all those things combined makes for the actual team and the drivers themselves figure out those things. And it's not about the machine. So it's the actual human influence of that on the car during that 60 minutes that makes for the best team, car, teammates, crew, driver included, to get that pole. So all those things combined, it makes for me a purest way to all things combined. It's different than a race. It changes differently, but those 60 minutes at the end for me are more representative of who should be first and who should be last.
Yeah, it's interesting because when you have like these the mini sort of qualifying sessions that we have that have right now, where it's broken up into the 3 sessions and you just get blocks of cars eliminated, it is a much smaller session, 15 or 18 minutes or whatever it is, compared to that 60 minutes. And as you say, over that vast amount of time, the track conditions and weather, everything can change during that time. But they're also considering for 2017 some new formats. I think that this elimination type qualifying that's now redundant and gone the way of the dodo bird did have possibilities. It was just the way that it implemented, it just didn't really work out to the potential that perhaps it had. But they're talking sorry, go ahead.
Here's an idea. You do the same elimination format, but for 60 minutes. And how you eliminate them? Well, after you're done 2-3 laps and you can't cut it, you just don't go back out anymore. And during that time period, eventually you only have like 4 or 6 cars remaining. So there's a lot of space on the track. There's nobody else in your way. And you can even beat your time and go for maybe the track record. So those could be ideas that could be fun to watch. If you mix that 60 minute and everything changes, probably for the better at the end, because you got the rubber on the track for 60 minutes. And if there's only 2 cars remaining and battling for the pole, you can get really exciting time and type of laps on those tracks.
Yeah, well, they're even talking that perhaps for next year that they're going to have some sort of like a point scoring race that will count on a Saturday afternoon, because I think that's what the whole idea about this elimination type qualifying that they've just gotten rid of was that it was to make it more exciting, make it more of a spectacle, but just the implementation of it just didn't actually work out. Mm-hmm. And unfortunately, it had the complete opposite effect, because if you go back to the Australian Grand Prix, while there are still cars on the track, and as Lewis Hamilton is coming into the pits, you see Sebastian Vettel walking up the pit lane wearing a pair of runners and a jeans, and he's wearing his Ferrari hat and a jacket, getting ready to go to the press conference. And it was weird not to have these large spaces of time where guys were getting eliminated from the qualifying, and they're not even on the track when it's happening. So it was a shame it didn't work out, but perhaps they can move forward from that and go back to a format that they know works, and then build on that and perhaps come up with something more exciting, because they do want to provide more of a spectacle, more value for the fans' hard-earned money, because a race pass is expensive, as I can attest to. We last went to the Spanish Grand Prix in 2014, and we did feel that even though that Barcelona is a lovely, lovely city and there's so many fantastic things to see and do there, that we had to spend every minute of the week possibly could at the Grand Prix, at the circuits, taking in everything, because it's not just a ticket, it's also a very big investment for 2 or 3 days. So anything that they can do from that point of view, I think would be very good as well.
I'm just a little bit afraid, Mark, that if they try to do too much things to make the Saturday more interesting, then it's going to take a little bit of focus on the actual race. It's going to take a little bit away from the magical finish of a race, of a win, of a championship. If you put too much gimmick and too many, if this happened, okay, and I was going to put minefield. There's a minefield on the track that during the qualification they have to avoid. I'm exaggerating here, but just to express my feeling that I'm scared that if they do too much, they're trying to decorate, to put too much ribbon on that package. That's not going to be nice. And sometimes the race itself is the most important day of that weekend. It is the most important way to get points, to actually make stride in your season. It's in the race that you see progress. So those things are important because that's where they get paid. It's a Sunday. I don't think they should put too much attention on the Saturday. I think that can be done by not F1 itself, but what used to happen too is 10, 15 different series used to follow F1 and have races. And that's where the Saturday was fun, is you see the F3 back then, or you see other smaller leagues of racing competing on that track that does give you that money's worth for that pass. And sometimes if you denature too much what the qualification process or what F1 is, I don't think people will actually get behind it.
Yeah, and it could be one of those situations where if it gets too gimmicky, more could actually end up being less, if that makes any sense.
Formula E should be every Saturday before an F1 race.
Yeah, that's a very intriguing formula, and I'd like to see more of it. Just on a complete different tangent, I was watching this documentary on Netflix last week about these electric motorcycles that participated for the first time several years ago at the Isle of Man TT, and how they were trying to make these bikes faster and more energy efficient and try to get like an average lap of 100 miles an hour around that famous circuit. But it's that would definitely be an interesting thing to include on a race ticket, would be Formula E. And also, before we completely leave Bahrain, one thing I did want to bring up was the performance of McLaren's reserve driver Stoffel van Dorn, who was deputizing for Fernando Alonso, who was obviously on the sidelines, or I shouldn't say the sidelines, this is in soccer, who was on the pit wall with McLaren because he was medically ruled out from that one. And I was not surprised afterwards to hear that he had some broken ribs and some bruising and things like that after that
probably
huge
a concussion problem.
Yeah, I mean, it was amazing how he got out of that car. But even after, like, my wife and I, we watch every race, and when we watched that, like how he immediately got out of the car, we were just like, that must be complete adrenaline. And when
Mark, we didn't even know that it was a car first.
Oh,
you just see the first car.
Yes.
And the way it happened in the camera, the way it was shot, the commentators, I was watching it on the English feed, so they don't even, on Sky, I think, they don't even see the other car. They just talk about this car, like, oh, I'm wondering what happened. He probably just got off in the background, and they don't know the actual collision. Slowly, the camera pans out, and you just see something. Oh, that's a tire. That's a car. That's the remnants of a car. Where's the driver? And you see him just laid back, already on the tires in the back when talking to the other driver. His name escaped me. But yeah, it was just mind-boggling that actually was a car. Remind me of the 99 bar crash by Jacques Villeneuve at Spa-Francorchamps at Eau Rouge, when that car was half blue and half white, and the remnants of a car was literally the same as the Alonso car, basically nothing. Just the fuselage, and that's about it.
Yeah, well, it was amazing. Like Alonso's car was just completely disintegrated. When you just see the little bits of it, it was actually had gone all the way through the gravel trap and was at the back of the whole runoff area there against the last set of tires. And to see him get out, and Yeah, I guess it wasn't really too much of a shock to hear after all that he did have some injuries, but it sounds that he will be medically cleared, or at least he expects to be, for China next week. But McLaren's reserve driver Stoffel van Dorn, 24-year-old Belgian, came in, scored points, getting a P10 for the McLaren, which was better than Jenson Button, who didn't finish the race. He had a P14 in Australia. And it's interesting, it lends to a bigger discussion. Is perhaps he a guy that could get that seat at McLaren, because in 2017 Alonso has a contract with McLaren, but Button doesn't have a contract beyond this year. He was very impressive. He didn't even know until a couple of days before the Grand Prix. He had to fly in from Japan and never even driven the car. I believe he may have driven the simulator, but he actually hadn't been on the track. So
it's not the same. Yes, it's a simulator, but I'm not going to believe it. I'm not going to buy that it's the same. Never.
Yeah. It may help with certain things, like being able to run the different layout, systems and things like that. But there is no there is no substitute for actually getting in the car physically and getting onto the pavement and driving around that circuit and just having the feel of the asphalt underneath you. And that was just a very, very impressive performance from him. But before we wrap things up, there was something else you wanted to mention in the Panama Papers scandal that broke earlier this week that related somewhat to Formula One.
Yes, absolutely. Nico Rosberg name has come up over the last couple of days, well, actually 3 days ago, in the Panama Papers scandal. Just quickly, layman's term, Panama Papers. It's an investigative report that was published in the last couple of days by more than 100 journalists from across the world, specifically from London, Europe, and South America, that eventually figured out, and Australia as well is implicated as a journalistic investigative reporters in that great world scandal that prime ministers, sports world leaders, sports personalities, celebrities, bankers, politicians have been involved. You just look at the former Iceland prime minister has already resigned. Mm-hmm. A lot of the Royal Bank of Canada's name has come up once in those papers. When we say the name come up, is basically it's a offshore money laundering process. We can go on and talking about how it works, but there is one law firm, Mossack Fonseca's law firm, in Panama City, a tiny little building. Over 300 companies have been found to be addressed there, and when in those actually papers, that's why it's called Panama Papers. In the papers that have been published, over 100,000 documents have been put on WikiLeaks and different media over the last couple of days concerning the Panama Papers. Those names have come up because there's a company, third-party company, with the names of Nico Rosberg and other names, but in this case, Nico Rosberg and his father, that has been found in those leaked documents. So for now, that's the extent of what Nico Rosberg's involvement is, if any. The presumptions of innocence is important before proven guilty, but his name has come up in those documents that were published a couple of days ago.
Yeah, it's very interesting. I've sort of been following the thing, or this case as it breaks, and it's basically lots of people who have lots of money and have been trying to find different ways to get around normal banking rules, and people who have a lot more money than you and I am. I'm afraid.
Probably all our listeners combined.
Probably, I'm sure.
But it's not really. I'm not really surprised at the F1, and there's some UEFA, the new actually head of FIFA. Gianni Infantino, who is now the secretary. He's now used to be the secretary of the UEFA. His name has come up too. His signature was on a piece of paper. This means a lot of things that we don't know, but all across the world and all across sphere of society, names have been linked to this report. And I think it's important to mention when it has to do with sports that we do like. And I don't think we're really surprised that F1 personalities were on this thing because of the amount of money involved and, the offshore and tax haven that Panama does offer. We're not really surprised. And fraud scandals with money in the world of F1, with the history of Bernie Ecclestone over 40, 50 years ago, and all the Flavio Briatore, all those different stories that happened over the last 30, 40, 50 years that we've seen in F1. So we're not necessarily surprised by the appearance of Nico Rosberg's name in those papers, but just a little reminder of maybe F1's dark side sometime.
Yeah, I think that goes for most sports. I mean, obviously, you and I do a lot of coverage and reporting for soccer, so we've been following the FIFA side of that scandal for a long time. So it'll be interesting to see what comes out in the following weeks and months with the Panama Papers. So, anyways, just before we close up, we've got the Chinese Grand Prix in Shanghai next weekend. What are you looking forward to? What are you keeping your eye on for that race, Kevin?
Lewis Hamilton's first turn. We'll see if he actually changes the trend in the third week. That's going to be interesting. I'm looking for Ferrari. Can they continue to close that gap little by little? But can the car sustain the different Chinese weather, the heat that's probably going to be present, or maybe the lack of thereof? So all those little intangibles are really interesting. When you're trying to close the gap, it really affects you. And if the car doesn't hold up, well, it's going to be interesting where Ferrari finishes after this race in the drivers and the constructors championship. So all those things are interesting, but what I'm really looking forward to is the qualification to see where Hamilton is. Because to be honest, the biggest threat to Nico Rosberg after 2 races is still Lewis Hamilton. So how he starts the race, where he does start the race, and how his first turn goes will be tremendous importance for how he finishes the race.
Definitely. And then for myself, not only that, the Ferrari and Mercedes battle, the battle between Hamilton and Rosberg, and perhaps Hamilton
Haas get him the point for a third straight race? And you know what? That's their goal now. They stated this morning that, you know what, from now on, our goal is to make points in every damn race. Why not? We can at least try to do that.
Exactly. And it'll be great to see them have another good race. It'll be good to see perhaps maybe Verstappen mixing it up again. And we'll see again if Red Bull, who have had some good couple good runnings here the last 2 races, see if they can get up there again and be in the thick of things. So plenty of enjoyable racing coming up over the next couple of weeks, and then it won't be too long before the F1 circus comes here to Canada, into your hometown, and which will be really cool. So we'll be talking about that at some point. But before we wrap things up here, Kevin, do you want to let everybody know where they can find you online?
Absolutely. You can reach me on Twitter at Kev Laramée, and you can find all the work that I do at one easy place, such as this show as well, sportspodcastingnetwork.com.
Perfect. Well, thank you very much for joining me tonight, Kevin. We'll talk again soon. And thank you very much to all of you listening. If you want to get a hold of me, you can email me at scuderiaf1pod@gmail.com, or you can tweet me at scuderiaf1pod on Twitter. That's it for tonight. That's a wrap. We'll catch you guys again next week.
Thanks for listening to the Scuderia F1 podcast. If you want to get the show notes for this episode, then head over to ScuderiaF1pod.com. Want to get in touch with us? Then email us at ScuderiaF1pod@gmail.com.